All right, so this is an exciting moment. This is our last Django lesson. Tomorrow we're going to have a Django review and then release the assessment. As someone was asking about the other day, the Django assessment is going to entirely focus on Django. You're not going to have to use React. Today, we're really learning about the core piece that's going to let us connect our front end and our back end. And we're actually going to have a lesson on that Monday morning. Authentication is the key that connects the front end and the back end because, well, there's a lot of great stuff we can do with the Pokemon API. You know, if like, as someone was saying yesterday, if you think back to maybe the Pokemon app that you wrote for the React assessment, you know, you could like build your Pokemon team, right? But what if we want to make a Pokemon game? Well, then different users are going to have different Pokemon teams. And at that point, we need different user accounts. And at that point, we need a way for users to securely log in, right? To authenticate that I am who I say I am, and for the application to authorize me to look at that data. And, you know, for things that are more serious, such as, say, online banks, credit card processing, ordering groceries online, authentication and authorization matters even more. So today we're going to look at the back end of authentication. We're going to look a tiny bit at what happens in terms of handling on the front end. We're going to look more at that on Monday. So today we're focusing on Django authentication. And we're going to be briefly talking about different kinds of authentication. We're going to see that we have to create a user model, that there are some migrations that need to be applied. The kind of authentication we're going to focus on with Django REST framework is token authentication. And then we're actually going to create some Django views for registration, for sign up, for creating a user, logging in, logging out, an endpoint to give user info, which will demonstrate writing a view that requires authentication and how we can use authentication to get information specific to that user. And if we have time, we'll also see how now that we're using authentication, we just have to make one or two changes in terms of how we use Django admin and Django admin superuser. Do folks have any questions about the agenda for today? All right, let's dive on in. So, you know, over here on the left in the curriculum doc, you see we have this list of different kinds of authentication, and this is not unique to Django. These are authentication strategies that are common to web applications. There's something called basic authentication, session authentication, and token authentication. And token authentication is where we're going to end up and focus on today, but looking at each of these, I think, will be useful. And if we open up Thunder client, and let's say I want to make a GET request, and let's just make up an endpoint API / v1 / my user profile. Well, we've seen these request headers, right? And it turns out that these HTTP request headers end up being pretty important for authentication. And in fact, let me just pull up real quick one of the docs from the amazing Mozilla Developer Network, which is the source of all great documents on the web. HTTP has a sort of built-in authentication framework. And you can kind of see the flow here, and this is what we'll learn about as we get into this, because I can send my username and password every time, but it's not that efficient. But what we're going to see is that there's an authenticate header request header that we can use to implement this. Or excuse me, authorization. I always get these confused. And so this is the header that we're going to be adding to all of our HTTP requests. The syntax for it is pretty straightforward. The name of the header is authorization, and it has 2 strings separated by a space. The first is the kind of authorization, because there's basic and there's token, and then credentials. And we'll see what that means in just a moment. So for example, for this GET request, I could add an authorization header and tell the server, hey, we're using basic authentication, and let's make sure that I get, in fact, this right. For basic authentication, we want to use a username. There's all this stuff that is less important, but we could also add a password. And it might look something like this. And I could send, yeah, and normally this is done with a hash because sending a password in clear text is not very secure, but that's where we're going to go in just a minute. And let me just kind of scroll back up to the top here. So just as an example, to sort of get the show started, this is something that we could do. And now in this HTTP request, in this header, there's username and password information that we've seen, our server can get and do stuff with to log the user in or whatever we need to do. This isn't very secure for obvious reasons, because maybe I'm logging in at a coffee shop, and what if someone is like maliciously capturing Wi-Fi, or when I'm at the coffee shop, this HTTP request with my username and password for, I don't know, my bank account, just to use an extreme example, goes from the Wi-Fi router to some DNS server to another server, and it goes through a whole bunch of servers before it actually gets to the bank, right? Because the internet is this whole network of servers. So this one request, we don't actually know where it's going. HTTPS, as you can see right here, the S is for secure. That does guarantee encryption so that all of this traffic is encrypted. But it's still not the best idea. And so obviously to log in, I need to send a username and password. And that's why HTTPS is so important, so that first time I log in, my username and password are encrypted in the request. But from that point on, it'd be really nice if I didn't have to send my username and password every single time, right? And so what the server is actually going to do is send back a token, some sort of hashed value that indicates that I've logged in, right? And it might look, I don't know, something like that. And the server has to store this token, but the server knows it's for me, my user, and the server probably has a way of, like, it's called time to live, deciding when this token should no longer be valid, right? Maybe it's 4 hours, maybe it's 1 hour if I'm a bank. If we're Reddit, maybe it's 2 days. And when you've ever logged into a site and not logged out, and then a couple of days later you had to log in again, it's because the time to live on your token is done. And if we're using Axios, once we get this token, we might write some JavaScript code that looks something like this. And in fact, we can just write out the whole thing of, let's just grab Axios, or that's probably the better way to do it, though I don't have NPM or anything installed, so none of this code is actually going to work. But I could do Axios get HTTPS, let's say like dbank slash API slash v1 slash login. And what we might do here is we might, in the actual body of the request, pass the username and password. So it might look something like this, username, Adam, password. And once we are logged in and our front end code has the token, and we'll learn more about how to write the front end code for this on Monday, where to store this token, how to use Axios, then life becomes a little easier with Axios. And excuse me just one moment as I pull up the guide code that I want here. Because we can just use Axios headers. And I can say Axios get HTTP, HTTPS, vbank, API, v1, like my account. Headers, authorization, basic, and then let's just say, pretend we got the token from the above call. We can pass in the token right there. And in fact, Axios makes this even easier. And we'll see this again more Monday. But as soon as we log in, we can set the authorization header for all of the requests our front end makes with Axios to our token, right? Because the thing is, once we start having authentication in the mix, every single HTTP request, I need to include some sort of authorization, whether it's a username and password or a token. And as we discussed, it's not a good idea to send username and password all the time. So the idea is you log in once with your new username and password, which if you look over to this diagram on the left over here, right, here's my front end, here's Django, and here we get the username and password, and the server sends back a token. And now on every single HTTP request, we pass that token in an authorization header, right? Otherwise, if we don't, the server will say, hey, you're not authorized to view like account information for anyone. And I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions sort of about like the big picture with this. And then we're going to kind of start implementing in Django. And just to recap, we don't want to send username and password all the time. We send it once, we get back a token, And then in all of our future HTTP requests, we set an authorization header on the HTTP request. And we use this scheme where we say, we're not saying basic anymore, we're saying token, and we pass that authorization token. And our Django server actually stores that authorization token in the database, which we'll see in a little bit. Anything on people's minds that might be useful to go over? All right, let's start doing a little bit of implementation. So basic authentication we talked about. Send the username and password, but it ends up in plain text. It's not ideal. Session authentication, we're not going to implement today, but it's where an HTTP cookie is used, and the server in that cookie sends back a session ID, and that's what's used to authenticate. It adds a couple complications. Django kind of blends the two. Token authentication is a really common strategy because it is simple. It is actually, while there's a lot of setup steps with Django, the basic concept of token authentication is extremely simple. So Django has an abstract user model already created. And that's where a lot of the authentication logic that Django has for us is that we're going to use. And as always, we have our Pokemon app that we've been building up over the last several days here, right? With the Pokemon models and the move models and the API endpoints from yesterday for the noun, from the other day for the noun project. And we have over here, our endpoint to view all our Pokemon. And this is what we're going to now start adding stuff to. So I'm going to make a new Django app. We're going to call it trainer app, as in a Pokemon trainer for the Pokemon game. And this is where we'll put all of the code dealing with user accounts. And so for your personal project, you might just call this user app. In some ways, I think that's the simplest way to name it. Since everything else here is Pokemon related, and the user in this case is going to be a Pokemon trainer, it kind of makes sense to have the name reflect the domain. We are going to have to make a couple changes. I've added this app, so I have to update settings.py in the project. Right, I got to go down here. Let's add our trainer app. We're going to have to make some other changes as well to settings.py to set up Django REST framework. So I'm going to jump ahead a bit, and we do have this mapped out here. Django REST framework has token authentication, a lot of classes that we can use for token authentication that hook into how Django does token authentication. So we're going to have to add to install apps. Well, we already have REST framework, but we have to specifically import this module, REST framework.auth token, which comes from Django REST framework. So that's the first change I have to make, is I have to add REST framework.auth token to installed apps. I then also in settings.py, where we configure Django REST framework, have to tell it how we're going to do authentication by default. And that should be, in fact, we may not even have that because we haven't needed it yet. So let's go ahead and add that to our settings.py. Let's just add it right here below databases. Django REST framework configuration. And as you can see, it's a dictionary. And let me go ahead and give us a little room here. And obviously these are magic names that Django REST framework is looking for here. And we're telling Django REST framework, here's a list of the authentication classes that you should by default use for authentication stuff. And we're telling it, hey, you should use your own token authentication class, because there's multiple authentication schemes, right? There's session authentication using cookies, and there's other approaches. So we actually do have to tell Django how we want to authenticate. Eric, yes, sir.
You have a spelling error on line 96, REST framework.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. And the editor has no way of knowing that is misspelled, so that would have been a pain. And in fact, my find now is showing it up in orange, which is great. So now that we've done this, like, whenever you add an app to installed apps, it's a good idea to run make migrations. And with authentication specifically, we're going to see that a couple migrations get created for us. And let's see what tables get added to the database. So make migrations didn't show anything, but if we do migrate, it turns out that actually there were migrations to be applied. And that's because the migration files already existed in that auth token app. So this is a potential gotcha. Remember that when you're setting up authentication, you have to run the migrate command, even if make migrations doesn't show you any changes, because that REST framework, the auth app that you've added, has some migrations already. And let's take a look in pSQL and see what tables have been added here. I see some stuff saying like auth token and this and that, because this will help us understand how authentication works, how Django handles the authentication token, and how it connects it to our user model once we get there. So now I'm in pSQL. And let's look at all the different tables. And we see auth group permissions, auth permission, auth user, auth token, right? And those look awfully interesting. Auth user and auth token. And I apologize, we should have looked at this list before we applied the migration, but I'm pretty darn sure they did not exist a couple minutes ago. So let's look at auth user and see what's going on here. And Django has done a lot of stuff here for us, and this is going to tie into that abstract user model, right? That we're going to inherit when we read our own user class. We don't have to do this from scratch. Of course, there's an ID. We can see that Django has created a password column. Passwords never get stored as plain text in the database. Django will use a hashing algorithm so that it's not quite the same as encryption, but so that like a changed version of the password that gets stored in the database, that it is harder to decrypt, essentially, if like a malicious programmer gets access to the database somehow. And like, I think it was maybe like the Target data breach. Like every couple of years you hear about some massive company where some black hat hacker gets access to their system, which means access to their database, and the passwords were stored in plain text, which is silly. We can see that Django keeps track of when the user last logged in. This very interesting is super user. And this is important because this is what we're going to have to set to true to use Django admin. A username field, which is important because we're going to have to tell Django what to look for the username field. First name, last name, email, is staff. This is also, I think, important for Django admin, and is active. And this is important too, because it's useful to have a record of your users, especially say if you have to like maybe ban a user or deactivate an account for whatever reason. You might want to keep that user account in your database for a number of reasons, but you might want to not have that user account be active. Right. And we also see that this table is referenced by a number of other tables, auth user groups, and auth user permissions, and very interestingly, auth token token. And let's take a look at auth token token, because that's the one that we care about a lot. And what we see here is really interesting. Key is going to be the actual token value itself. We have a timestamp created, so the database knows when it's created. So if Django wants to, it knows like after 2 days, it should delete this token, and it can check. And we have user ID, which is a foreign key, pointing to auth user, right? So the database has already set up the relationship, and it's probably a one-to-one relationship between auth token token and auth user, the auth user table, so that we can connect a user to their authentication token. And I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions. Erica, yes.
Oh, super quickly. I posted in Easter questions. Is active could be false if the account is banned, right? Or if like there's a feature to temporarily deactivate.
Say that again.
Is active could be false if the account is banned, right? Is that a good way to, like, for example, ban an account?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what is active is for. If I'm banning an account, I probably want to, like, we might want to add like a reason field so we could keep track of it. But is active, a lot of companies just never delete user accounts. I'm pretty darn sure Facebook does this. You know, if you like deactivate account and reactivate it later because you decide you want to like rejoin Netflix, right? That's a more benign example of why is active is useful, but absolutely for banning as well, we would set is active to false. Does that help answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, great question. Right, and just to recap, like if we have these two tables here, you know, let's see, what are these things called? Auth user, auth token, and you know, there's, you know, ID, username, whatever, right? And auth token, here we have like key, created, user ID, and this is our foreign key, right? Between user ID and ID. And this is how the two tables get connected to each other. Okay, so we've peeked under a hood a bit to see how this stuff is actually stored in the database. That the token is it's stored as a row in a table, that there's not any magic. Let's actually create our user model now, and let's start building this out. Let me bring this down. And so again, we have this code over here, and this is what we're going to add, and this is what we're going to talk through. And we're going to add it over here in the models for our trainer app or our user app. We need to import the abstract user. and it looks like I have a typo. From Django.contrib, auth.models, import abstract user. And this is our standard user account. I'm going to name the model trainer, and it's going to inherit abstract user. If we wanted to, we could name it user. Because we're sticking with the Pokemon theme and for our program, this user is a Pokemon trainer, I'm naming it trainer. There's a couple things we're gonna do here. We're gonna explicitly add an email field. And we're just gonna give a little bit of just some sensible defaults here. There is one important thing here I'm going to do with the email field. I'm setting unique to true. We're going to use the email instead of a username. So emails must be unique. And to do this, I have to tell Django we are using email instead of username, because the username field is special for Django and for Django's abstract user. And it's so special that I have to set this attribute in all caps and give it the name of the field, so that when we're logging in, Django knows which field to look at for authentication and logging in and stuff like that. We can also set required fields, and this comes from AbstractUser. By default, email and password are required, so we don't have to add them. But if we wanted to add another required field here, we could. Right, so the important thing is, and you'll probably want to do this just because it makes life easier, so you don't have to deal with usernames on top of emails, though usernames can be cool. But for simplicity, I just wanted to be able to use an email and a password, so we have to set the email field to be unique, and then I have to tell Django that that's what we're doing. Earl John, yes, sir.
Just a quick question on the abstract user and the user. So I know that the abstract user allows you to add stuff. Does that
one moment, Earl John, I apologize. Hold on.
Okay.
Sorry, I had to chat with someone in the classroom real quick. Say that again, please.
So I know that the difference between the user and the abstract user is that the abstract user, you can add more fields to it. Is that also you can also edit fields in the abstract user and you can't with just the regular user?
That's a good question. Let's actually take a look at the Django user model. So for one thing, if I use the default Django user model, I can't give it a different name like I do with trainer. I don't think the user model is meant to be inherited. So I think you're saying, we're kind of stuck with the fields that it has. While abstract user, on the other hand, is meant to be inherited. So it gives us more flexibility, because I can inherit it onto my own custom user class and add whatever fields I want, which I think is sort of what you were asking about, correct?
Yes. Yeah, because I was confused because we already have an email field in the abstract user that you showed earlier, but we are also adding another email field. This is just editing that email field to have a specific way of inputting, right?
Let's actually take a look at the abstract user class. Let's see what's in here. So this, in fact, inherits from something called abstract base user. So we might have to scroll even further down, but we can see right here the model definition, and just like we create fields, we can see that Django is doing it the same way. And it has a username here with some validation, first name, last name. So this is the important thing here. By default, the abstract user's email field can be blank and doesn't have to be unique. So we want to override that, right? We want, because I want to use the email instead of the username. I don't want it to be blank. I want it to have to be unique. And in fact, I guess we should add blank equals false, though the unique true might override it. So just like sort of with method overriding, if you guys remember like polymorphism and inheritance, like what we're doing here is this overrides that other email field. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, that answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So as the Django docs say, and I think the Django docs actually on customizing authentication are quite good. We can extend the default user model, because I'm like 99% sure that Django default user model also inherits from abstract base user, which we could in fact look at as well. And it inherits from abstract user, right? Which I think is almost the same thing. There's also an abstract base user class that we don't have to worry about, but we can see that user basically inherits from abstract user, just like we're doing with our trainer. It just doesn't do anything to it, right? So just, if you kind of just do it this way off the bat, it just gives you more flexibility and simplicity, and there's not a lot that's lost. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, great question, right? Because, you know, you can just name this my user, or, I mean, if you want, you can just name it user or whatever. And even if you don't change anything, you might want to change something later, and this way you're set up to do that. And we're talking like one line of code of difference. With the default Django user model, we can't like change the email field and stuff like that. So we've created now our own user model, right? A custom user model. We now have to tell Django that this is the case. And as with all things Django, this is going to happen in settings.py. And somewhere in here, and in fact, I might need to add it. And I think indeed we do need to add it. We need to add this auth user model setting, and I'm just going to make sure that it doesn't already exist. I'm not seeing it. We might as well add it right here below Django REST framework. Tell Django what user model to use for authentication. And we have to give it the name of the Django app and then the name of the model. Right, and this is a little bit of a pain, but this gives us so much flexibility and control. So now that we've done all this, let's create some migrations and apply them, since we've created a brand new model. And let me move into the right project directory. And we have a model to create this trainer model. If we look at that migration file, I'm actually not sure if there's anything interesting in there. But we can see, so this is interesting, right? A password field has been added for us. All these fields that come from abstract user have been added for us. And let's go ahead and apply this migration. And let's see what it did not like. inconsistent migration history, if you all can see down here where this error message is. Inconsistent migration history. Migration admin 001 is applied before its dependency trainer 001 on database default. So this is telling me that the admin, some admin, Django admin related migration is unhappy because it now depends on my user model, my trainer migration. Any thoughts as to like why that's the case? And I realize that's a little bit of an open-ended question, but think about it. With Django admin, we had to log in, right? Django admin requires authentication. And we just changed like how authentication works with Django. So it kind of makes sense that we would get this complaint, because whatever the heck this migration is, it was probably just using the normal Django user model, and now we're like creating this trainer model that it now depends on after. So we actually have to drop and rebuild our database. So when you're working on your personal projects, I highly recommend getting this authentication stuff, this sort of skeleton stuff set up right away. And this is also a good reason why it's nice to have fixtures, right? So that, yes, I'm going to drop the database, but I've got fixture data for a couple Pokemon, right? And a couple Pokemon moves, not a ton, but a few. So dropping the database should not be too bad. Drop DB, Pokédex DB. We'll give Postgres a minute to delete itself. And actually it may not be able to because I'm logged in. So let me disconnect from the Pokédex DB database and just connect to the default Postgres database. And let's just drop it here as long as I'm here in pSQL. So you're going to have to drop and recreate your database and reapply your migrations when you add authentication, if you've already set up Django admin, because we've changed the main model used for authentication, and Django admin depends on that. So just as a sanity check, I'm going to run make migrations again, even though I did 30 seconds ago. And now everything works, right? And note right here, Django applied our trainer app migration first, before the admin migration, right? Because as Django said, now this admin migration actually depends on that trainer app, because that creates our model used for user authentication. Earl John, yes, sir.
Is it a common practice to build the authentication or like the user first before you build your whole app?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, imagine we're making a to-do list app, and we want, you know, when I log in, I can see my to-dos. You can imagine how on the back end and even on the front end, like the authentication logic is going to be sort of like deeper or lower in the code, if that makes sense. So stuff like that, you just want to do it first and get it out of the way. I call it skeleton code, like React Router. You know, think about making a React app that you know is going to have a bunch of pages, but trying to add React Router last. Yeah, so for your personal projects, I absolutely encourage everyone to tackle authentication as the first thing you get set up. or one of the very first things. And it's also something that you explicitly get points for, and we'll get a grading rubric out on it. So it's a win-win. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground, and it's actually almost 10 o'clock. So I think this is probably a good time for a break. We've talked about the different kinds of authentication. We've created a user model. We've seen all the setup steps to use Django REST Framework's token authentication. We've seen that we have to drop the database. We've seen that there's a number of setup steps, but that once you walk through them, it all makes sense and it's not too painful, right? And it's also, this is another good reason to just do authentication right away when you're starting on your personal project and just get it done so that I don't have to think about it again. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll or let's just take like a 14-minute break, and we'll just come back at like 10 after. And we'll look at how to create endpoints, routes, and view functions to sign up, right? To create a user account, to log in, to log out, and to get user info. I think the plan for today is to take breaks and just move through the lecture, because there's not really like a good part one assignment, because the first authentication assignment we have for you all is to add endpoints. Though actually, let me check in with you all. So the assignment we have is, unsurprisingly, we have an app. We want you to create a user. We want you to create a sign-up endpoint, a login endpoint, right? Log out, and information about the users. And then also basically the backend logic for a to-do list. So we haven't covered that stuff yet. My assumption is that it'd be more useful to, and let me go ahead and pause the recording, because we can talk about this and it doesn't need to go on the recording, and that way it can be a little tighter. All right, we've talked about different kinds of authentication. We've seen how to use Django's AbstractUser to create our own user model and all the steps we need to do to set this up. We're now going to dive into creating endpoints, the paths and URL patterns, and the API view classes and methods for user registration or sign up, right? To create a user account, to log in to get that token, to log out, and user info. Before we dive into this, let me do a little diagramming. Let's talk about how token authentication works and the workflow, which we've talked about a little bit, but let's draw this out for the endpoints that we are about to create. And this is called, I think it's called a web flow diagram. And you'll see diagrams like this a lot. They're incredibly useful. When I was learning a lot of this stuff on the job, like my sort of senior peer, he'd take me to a whiteboard and he'd be like, all right, draw this out. Because I had to, my task was to implement like authentication with JSON web tokens. And that has a bunch of steps in the flow, which is what it's called, right? So, you know, over here, we've got a client. Over here on the right, we've got a server. And in between, we've got the internet, right? Now, it just so happens when we're doing local development, this is all on one machine. But since this is all HTTP requests, the client and the server can be anywhere. The server is our Django app, right? Someone remind me, what is the client? What's like one example of what the client program could be? Well, it could be Thunder client, right? And Brandon, yes, sir.
I was gonna say Thunder Client, or I was also gonna say the React front end or whoever is requesting the data.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be our React JS app running in the browser. It could also just potentially be the browser, right? We've seen that, hey, if I do, you know, if I do this, well, the server is not running, but this is a GET request. This is an HTTP GET request to an endpoint on the server. And when you do a form submission, it makes a POST request. So the browser is also a client. Now, obviously for us, it's actually going to be like the React.js app that we care about the most, because that's what you're going to use for all your personal projects. But the concept here is important. There's a lot of different clients. And the beauty of HTTP and REST APIs is that the server doesn't care what the client is. So let's say our client makes a GET request and it looks something like this. Let's say that we're creating a user account. And since we're creating something new, this should probably be a POST endpoint. And let's call this sign up. And in the body of this HTTP request is going to be some JSON. And it's going to have email. And we are going to have to pass a password. And I don't know, that, you know, that's user info. I am Alice. Just something here for account sign up. But the truth is we don't even need that, really, because all you need to sign up is a username and an email. We're not going to worry about like more complex flows that require like a confirmation email. But over here, Django, and let's go ahead and let's make a little diagram with a different shape for Postgres. Right, let's put Postgres over there. Let's make Postgres black just for simplicity. Right, and at this point, Django's gotta talk to Postgres. And we probably have a, let me just kind of drag this arrow where it needs to be. And, you know, let's say that Django has like class, maybe we can just call it sign up that inherits API view. And it's gotta create user model. And we probably also want to send back, let's just create the user model. In fact, we're not even going to send back an authentication token. So our sign up, we will when we implement it, but for the purposes of this diagram, we won't. And let me make this a bit smaller so we can see this all a bit more easily. We don't need quite this much space between everything. Right, so that's one HTTP post request to create a user account. Now that my user account is created, I need to log in, right? Alice needs to log in. So Alice is going to make a GET request. I have to double check if technically this should be like a GET or a PUT, but for now we'll call it a GET request. To probably the endpoint should be something like this, login. Now, what is the obvious thing that like I have to do when I log in most of the time to like a website? Not a trick question, I promise. Gary, yes, sir.
Username, password.
Yeah, exactly. And how are we going to send the username and password in this HTTP request? what's sort of our standard way for sending text data in an HTTP request? Earl John, yes, sir.
Is it a JSON or a dictionary?
Yeah, exactly. We're going to send some JSON in the body of the HTTP request that has the username and password. It could go in that authorization header. It's pretty common for it to be in the body of the request. And at this point, we might have a separate Django class here, maybe login that inherits from API view. And what does this class need to do? Well, it's got to check that username and password are valid, right? If they're valid, it's got to create or get an authentication token. And then it's got to send auth token to client. So let's assume this is a valid username and password. And then in our HTTP response, in the body of that response, in some JSON, we would see an auth token. And now what also happens is if that auth token doesn't already exist, Django has to save that auth token in the database. Right, because Postgres has to store all this information. Now, let's say I'm Alice and I want to get information about myself. Let's say when I signed up, I did pass some information, like, I don't know, about me. And I want to hit an endpoint that we're going to create, and it's going to be named info. And the goal of this is info, and maybe instead of login, this should be named user or something like that. But for simplicity, I think I'm just going to keep making different classes. We'll kind of see how, when we actually implement, how this works. But just for discussion purposes, like maybe just a user. Maybe we call it a user info. So I don't want to send back info I only want to send back Alice's info to Alice, right? I have to be logged in to see my info. So this function in our Django code is going to have to check if the request is authenticated. If it is, get info for that user, send info back. Right? So all of these different endpoints where I require authentication, like think about a to-do list. Like, I don't want you all to see my to-do list. We want to build our to-do list app so that like I as a user can only see my to-do lists that I've created. That's where authentication comes in. And the way that this happens is, excuse me, so sorry, in the request header. Where we're passing this authorization token. Right, and so now on every request, I have to pass this. So this is the web flow diagram of the code that we're about to create. We're also going to make a logout endpoint, but I'm not diagramming that out for now. I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions before we switch gears and start writing code. And does this sort of like help illustrate on a big picture what's going on, or is this just a little confusing right now because it's so abstract? Or maybe somewhere in the middle. I'll definitely share this diagram later. As I mentioned, like Webflow diagrams like this, like you can see right here, are like a really great tool for thinking about flow between your front end and your back end, right? For all sorts of things, for building out a to-do list app, for example. So now that we've talked through this, let's start implementing, and let's start with our registration and sign up code. So let's add the URL patterns that we're going to want to use. And let me go ahead and just kind of get the terminal out of the way. And close out the different files that we no longer need. And we'll start off with, for URLs PY in our project as a whole, we're going to add a path for our Django app. And I'm just going to call it /users. I know we called it trainer, and we maybe should have renamed the trainer app to something else. And now let's hop over to the URLs PY for our trainer app to set up the routes for our user model for the trainer model. And let me go ahead and create that URLs PY. And I'm totally going to borrow and just straight up copy some of this and get rid of this stuff I don't care about. We're not going to be using that. We're not going to be using that. We don't have any views yet, so I'll just comment this out. I'm going to write out these different paths that we're going to create, and then we're going to go ahead and create the API view functions for them. So we're going to have a sign up endpoint. And actually, as long as I'm doing this, I think I am going to create these view functions because I hate writing code that's not real. And again, I'm going to just borrow this stuff because this probably has like 2/3 of what I need for the models PY for my trainer app models. We're probably going to want to render stuff. We're going to want JSON response. We need API view. We need API view response. I don't need to import anything Pokemon or move related. It's that stuff. And let's go ahead and create these class-based API views. And I'm just going to go ahead and create them all right now. Right, and there were some questions earlier in the class about like, how do I go about implementing? How do I go about building? I think it's really important to try to always write actual working code. Like, I don't want to write code that I know doesn't work because then I can't run it to make sure I don't have typos. So even though all these API views do exist, it now means I can actually import them. And this tells me that I probably have a typo or something. Earl John, yes, sir.
You added them in the .models file instead of the views file.
Oh my God, that would be why. Thank you so much, man. That would do it, wouldn't it? So let me open up the views. Good catch. I apologize for the confusion. We are 100% writing our API views in views.py, not models.py. Right? And that's also a good example of why it's important, like, to write real code as you go, because that's an easy mistake to make. And if Earl John wasn't here to catch it for me, the fact that like I couldn't get this import to work, that VS Code was telling me it wasn't finding it, that's a sign that something was not right in my code. And now I can import these things just fine. And we're good to go. And now, even though this path doesn't do anything, this is real working code. I can run it and expect it not to throw an error. And if I run it and it has an error, it tells me that there's something I need to fix. Right, so let's just go ahead and rename what we need to rename. And I know I'm moving through this a bit more quickly. I just want to get this stuff set up. I think we can all sort of see the pattern here. And so now I have some real paths. I can actually run my code, and it's actually not the worst idea. Make sure I don't have any typos. None of those endpoints are going to do anything right now, but I can know they exist. If I was writing code for real, I would maybe add a method for each of them that just returned a response true, and then actually test it with Thunder Client. Because again, I hate writing code that's not real, and I love being able to run my code and like manually test as I go. But let's build this out a bit more before we do that. So sign up is going to be a post endpoint, right? Because we are creating a new user model. And actually, let's go ahead and do what I just said. Because you know what? I can use Thunder Client. I can make a post request. And let me make sure I remember the URL path /users/signup. And I get true back, which is great, because that tells me, frankly, that I don't have a typo in my code, which I make typos all the time, or I forget stuff. So I love writing my code in tiny bits. You know, there's a huge amount of value to writing this much code and running it and testing it with Thunder Client. But let's build this out a bit and see how this signup works. So the first thing is we need to get the username and password from the request body, right? So we also, Django needs a username field because that is how Django works. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make a copy of the body of the request, which is in request.data, right? Which we've been seeing over the last several days. And let me go ahead and move this comment over here, because what I need to do is I need to do data username equals request.data.get email. right? Because this is what we get in. Django, even though we've set like the email field to be the username field, when we're about to create a user account, Django still needs the username. I'm making a copy of this because there's something really nice we can do if we have a dictionary of our username and stuff, and I don't want to have to modify the actual request itself. I do need to import the trainer model. Because we need to create a new Pokemon trainer, right? Create new user. And what we can do now is we can do new trainer equals trainer, and I can use that double star quargs, if I'm saying it correctly, data to, and that's basically the same as trainer username equals, you know, data get username email equals data get email, and password equals data get password, right? But the the quargs will do this with the data dictionary for us. So this is a really useful pattern, and you will have to do this step right here. In one form or another, we do have to set a username for trainer. Right, so that's kind of the key thing. So now let's validate and save our new user to the DB. And then we're going to want to create an auth token and return it in the response. Because unlike this TL draw diagram over here, where we had to log in after signing up, it's actually really nice, right? We signed up over here, and then because we didn't send back a response with the token, we had to log in again. What we're going to do now is we're just going to send back a token, right? Because that makes life easier. For your React app, that way, as soon as the user has signed up, they can also automatically be logged in. Now, for like security best practices, you know, maybe you do want an email authentication kind of thing, so you might not always want to do that. But for our world, this is perfectly decent and makes life simpler and makes for a good user experience. And it's what you see for a lot of commercial websites too, where as soon as you sign up, you're logged in. Maybe you also have to do a confirmation email. Otherwise, like they deactivate your account in a day or something. So we've created this trainer. We're going to validate that data, save it to the database, and then we're going to have to create an auth token and send it back. And I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions about the code or what we're writing this far. And there is a little bit of difference between the way I'm writing the code and the way it's in the curriculum. So I think I'm just going to put this diagram up here off on the side because I don't want things to be confusing with like incorrect code on one side and then what I'm writing on the other. They both do the same thing. This implementation will just add a couple useful extra steps. So let's see. it's possible that we might run into an issue creating this trainer. It's possible that maybe that email already exists because it's unique. It's possible that validation fails. So we're going to need a try except block. And I'm going to need to import validation error. And let's see where I import validation error from. Import validation. Oh, Earl John, yes, sir.
I believe it's from Django.core.exceptions.
Oh, I think you are right. Thank you so much. And now we don't have to jump around between files. Perfect. Love it. Right, and we'll fill in the accept part of this logic in a minute. Let's add the try. Let's do a full clean to apply all our validation here. And then let's see about saving this new trainer to the database. I might as well put this here inside the try except block. There's no harm in it. Once we run this code, I need to check. I might need to make a minor change to how we do this and this save operation, but I think this should be correct for creating a new model instance, validating it, and saving it to the DB. So if we do run into an error, let's print that error. And let's also return a response. That should probably look something like this. Error, and we can say maybe e.message dict and response status is going to be HTTP, and let's just say 400 bad requests because we don't know exactly what went wrong. So now we're handling our exception. We have created a trainer, we have validated them, and we have saved them. And now the last thing that we want to do inside this try block is we want to create a token so that we can send back the user an authentication token. And the good news here is that there is a token class that we can use that will do this for us. And let me make sure I'm importing it from the right spot. And it's going to come from Django REST framework. And it is coming from REST framework.authToken.models. So this is actually the token model that corresponds with that auth token table we saw in Postgres. And we'll take a look at this model in just a minute. There's a bunch of other stuff we'll need to import from Django REST framework and from Django for more of our authentication. But this is a good starting point. And actually, I think we'll also want to import some logic so that we can log the user in. Because we not only need to create the auth token, we also need to log the user in so they can get the auth token. So let me go ahead and just import that stuff now, and also just import the rest of what we'll need. So in a little bit, we're we're going to import from, and there's a couple of imports here, so let me just make sure I get this right. From Django REST framework dot permissions. An is authenticated class. In a little bit from Django REST framework dot authentication, we're going to have to import a token authentication class. And finally, to round all of this out, from Django contrib auth, we're going to have to import some helper functions, which we're going to use now. And we're going to import, oh, excuse me, I don't want those parentheses. A function to authenticate for logging users in, or for authenticating token, a function for logging users in, and a function for logging users out. And I think that is all of our imports. And these are also in the curriculum doc, as there are a number of imports here. But now we should have what we need to create our authentication token and log the user in so they can actually use it. Making the token is pretty straightforward. We use the token class, and we're just going to do token.objects.create. And we have to tell Django what user we're creating the token for our new Pokemon trainer. And then we have to log the user in to authenticate them so that they can use this token. And we can actually just pass in the request here, and that should do it for us. And we need to tell login who is trying to log in. And now we can return a response that has information about our new trainer and about the token. So I think I'm going to return a response that looks just something like this. Actually, let me double check one of my other views. I'm not certain I'm getting this response format correct. So I'm going to pull up a view that we were working on the other day. I think probably a Pokemon one is a good one. And indeed, I don't need that data property at all. I just need to pass the dictionary with the data as the first argument and the status as the second. So this is not necessary. And I think I'll just do this. I'll just say info, new trainer, token, token. All right, so this is a lot of code. Let's take a quick look at some of these functions and classes and see what they're doing, and then we'll run the code. So if we look at this token class that we're getting from Django REST framework, we see that this is Django REST framework's default authorization token model. And just like we would expect with other models, it has fields. It has a field key to hold the token itself. I remember we saw this in PSQL. A field user, that is a one-to-one relationship between the token table and that auth user table, right? So this sets a one-to-one relationship between this model and our trainer model, because we've set the trainer model as the auth user model and created. And we see here, there's a method save. There's a method here that does some fancy stuff to actually generate the token key. And there's some other things as well. But this is actually a pretty straightforward model that looks like we could have written this ourselves, right? We don't know exactly what's going on here or here, but this part makes sense. Let's look at Django's login method. So this accepts an HTTP request. I don't have to pass in data. And it, in fact, is going to then look on the request to try and get a user instance. Django, it may attach this on the way in. We'll have to see if we have to make any changes here, if we might have to add a user object to the request. I would have expected it to look at request.data, but Django REST framework may actually be doing that for us, right? But we can see that this login function grabs the user and it's going to do some sort of hashing, basically to hash the user's password and compare it with the saved hash password in the database. And there's multiple ways to do this, right? For session authentication, as well as token authentication. We can see the logout method here as well. I don't want to dig too much through this code, but I think it's just useful to see that it's there and it's not magic. So now that we've written all this code, let's run it and see if it works, which is the real test, right? And then I think we can pause and see if there's questions or stuff that's good to go over. So just to reiterate, our signup code looks at the request. We add the username to this data field because we need it when we're creating this Pokemon trainer. We validate, we save our new user. We create an auth token for that user. And then we have to log the user in so they can use that auth token, and we send that information back. So I'm gonna, Earl John, yes, sir.
I think you have a type error in line 32.
What is my typo on line 32? Oh yeah. Thank you so much. Much better. And actually, do folks have questions about this code or stuff that might be good to talk about before I run it and we can see what works and what doesn't? All right, let's give it a shot. Once we get this working, we can take a break, and then the login and the logout and the info endpoints are more straightforward. So I'm going to use Thunder Client to test this. You're going to want to use Thunder Client more and more to test stuff because it's quick and easy. So I'm going to add an email field, alice@gmail.com, and a password. And I recommend always make your passwords the same for testing. I just use XYZ123. You don't actually want to have to remember passwords for testing and development. And I think the server's running. Just as a sanity check, we shouldn't have to restart it, but I will. And we have an error, which is not surprising because I actually wrote a whole lot of code. Like if I was sort of developing for real, I would have tried to run it as we go. So we run into this type error. Object of type trainer is not JSON serializable, which makes sense. That tells me that the error is probably coming from the response when it's trying to serialize the trainer object right here, because I haven't written a serializer. I'm not sure what the default serializer behavior is. Let's see, does the error message point out? It doesn't give me an explicit line number in my code, but based on the type of the error, because the serializing, I'm pretty sure would happen here. That's my guess. To double check that, let's look in Postgres and let's see if a user got created. So let me go ahead and clear this. And let me kind of do a reminder. We want to look at the auth token table, and we want to look at the trainer app trainer table. So this is good news. my trainer got created. That tells me that my code succeeded at least through line 30. Let's see if the token got created. And the token got created as well. This is also good news. This tells me that my code succeeded through here, through at least line 33. And the login request probably succeeded as well. In fact, there's a last login date right here. That is indeed today. And basically a minute or two ago. So that gives me pretty strong confidence that the issue here is indeed with like the serializing of this data. In the interests of being lazy, we could write a serializer. There are cleaner ways to do this. I am just going to construct the dictionary that we need, because to be honest, I don't think it sent back the password, but I don't want to send that back anyway. So let's just do that. And let's see if that works. Now, when I run this again, I get a different error. A user with that username already exists, right? So in some ways, actually dropping the database or deleting data can be useful. When testing user account stuff, it's really common to just have to create whole bunches of users. And now we're getting object of type token is not JSON serializable. So I kind of ran into the same issue there. Where I forgot that I have to not send back the whole token model instance. Can someone tell me, there's a very simple modification I can do to this line of code that should resolve that error. Can anyone tell me what it is?
Is
Well,
it just
what are the
sending back
feet?
the, sorry,
Oh,
is
yeah,
it
go
just
ahead.
sending back the token dot key? You only want to send
Yeah,
back the key, not the whole thing.
Exactly. We don't need the whole token model. We just need the key. So now, Alice, Bob, fingers crossed, third time is the charm. It's a little bit extra to have this wrapped in info, but as time goes on, you might have more stuff in this info structure here, and I like consistency in the structure of my JSON. So I don't necessarily mind the extra layer. And now we have registered a user, and we have actually logged them in and sent back that data that we can now use in Axios, right? If we open up that requests.js file, that token that we got back with this line of code right here, we can tell Axios for all future HTTP requests, set this auth header with this token. And now we've got authentication. What questions do folks have about this sign-up code? And how are we feeling about this? Like thumbs up, somewhere in the middle, thumbs down, sunshine, clouds, thunderstorms, tornadoes? I see a couple thumbs up. Okay, good deal. Let's take a break. It is almost 11. Let's take 10, and then we'll implement, to go back to our diagram, where it's almost 11. We'll implement the login and the logout endpoints, which are going to be pretty straightforward. And then we'll implement this info endpoint, which is also going to be relatively straightforward, especially now that we've kind of dug deep into what's going on with token. We've seen where the token is saved in the database and what these classes are doing. So let's take 10, and then we'll finish it off by writing all the endpoints we need for a full sign-up login flow. Sound good? Cool. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see you all in 10 minutes. So we've implemented this sign-up code. right? And we've tested it out and it works great. I think maybe I'll simplify this just a little bit. I just don't want an extra layer if I don't need it. And now I have a whole bunch of people in my database, right? And this is kind of a nicer JSON object to deal with in the response. And for our sign up endpoint, we made a copy of the data object. We have to set the username to be email because Django looks for the username. We have a try catch where we create our trainer, we validate them, we create the auth token, we use this login function, and if it all works, we return the response. Let's write a logout function. Now that we have login, let's do logout. So this is going to be a post request as well. And it would help if I put the def because it's going to be a method. And the great thing is that this is super easy to do. So Django REST framework gives us request.user for HTTP requests that have a valid auth token. So if I send an HTTP request and I'm sending the auth token in the request, Django and Django REST framework, before the HTTP request even gets to our code, will just grab that user from the database and stick it on the request object. So I can actually do request.user.auth token, delete. And I can just do log out and pass it the request. And if we take a quick look at this Django's logout method, we see it removes the authenticated user's ID from the request, flushes their session data, right? It's expecting some sort of attribute user, like a model instance or a dictionary or something, to exist on the request object, and it deletes some stuff. And let's just return a response with a status of 204. That's sort of our standard delete. And let's actually see what this looks like. So, Cody, yes, sir.
You put that in the info function.
Oh, I totally did. Thank you. Let's name this log out and name this info. Thank you so much for mentioning that, man. So in a moment, we'll write login so we can actually use Thunder Client to get tokens more consistently. But I have the token for Evan right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. I'm frankly a little annoyed that we'll just put it right there so it's easy for me to find. So let's go ahead and watch what happens if we try to log out without passing an auth token. And I apologize. Actually, there's a couple things we need to add to this for this to work. We're going to get a couple different errors. For one thing, as always, I forget the slash. We see this attribution error. Anonymous user has no attribute auth token, right? So I need to pass that auth token in an authorization header. And we get a 204 no content. And if I go to pSQL and I do select star from trainers, I see Alice, I see Bob, I see Carol, I see David, but I don't see Evan. Now, there is something that we need to add here to this code to restrict like who can log people out. And what I need to add to this logout class is I need to add for this class attribute authentication classes, we need to pass this token authentication class. And for permission classes, we need to set is authenticated. Right, and it's not so relevant in some ways for logout because it uses the auth token to figure out who the person is. But this is what actually restricts all of these methods to only work for HTTP requests that have a valid auth token, where we can authenticate this request as coming from a valid user. Let's go ahead and implement login so that we can get our tokens more easily. And then we can implement if info, where we'll also have to add these, and we can kind of see what happens with and without them. So login is also going to be a post request because we may be creating a token in the database. So we may be creating something. So in fact, I should update my diagram over here. And for login, we need to grab the email from the request data. We need to grab the password from the request data. And we need to use that authenticate function that we imported before. And Django will hash the password using an algorithm that converts it into like a set. It's not random numbers and letters, but numbers and letters. And that's what's stored in the database. And hashing is a little out of scope, but it adds an extra layer of security. And Django compares it to the hashed password in the database for that email, right? Because we have each user's email, and this is sort of their username field, their unique identifier. We take the password, we apply essentially the encryption, the hashing algorithm, we compare it with the hashed version we have in the database, and if they match, we authenticate. So this authenticate function, it takes a username field because that's how Django thinks about logins. And since we're using email, we do have to set that here. And then for password, we're just going to pass password. And we do want to have an if block. If we've gotten the trainer, then we're going to use the token class to get a token. And token objects get or create. We'll look in the database if there's already an authentication token. If, say, the user logged in like 5 minutes ago for some reason, it will grab it. So we're not creating extra tokens that we don't need. If it doesn't exist, it will create it. And we have to pass it the user that it's going to do this for. And it returns, it's either a tuple or a set of the token itself and a Boolean if the token was created. And so if this has been successful, this should be successful, and we can just return a success response that has the token value, right? And we might as well return the email as well for consistency. Otherwise, invalid login. And we don't actually want to tell whoever's making this request if the email is good or bad, or if the token failed for security reasons. A malicious hacker could purposefully send bad login requests with various email addresses to try and figure out if, like, I have an account on here with my email. So we don't want to indicate in our response if there is or isn't an account for that email. So we just want to say something like invalid login credentials, and we'll just send 400 bad requests back. Right, so now, fingers crossed, over here, I should be able to do a post to log in, and let me make sure my server's running. Let me get rid of the typo. We're not passing an authorization header. I do have to pass email and password in there. Evan doesn't exist. Invalid login credentials. Perfect. It looks like something went wrong for Alice. So let's see what that is. Bad request API/user/login. We're not getting a lot of data back here, so let's do a little print statement debugging. And that should be enough to tell me when I run the request again with these print statements, I can trace the flow of my application, see how far it got, and see where it failed. So we got the trainer. We didn't get the token. Right? We got the trainer. Well, it looks like we didn't even get the trainer because this says bad request. Or excuse me, because this says none when I print out the trainer right here. So I did something wrong here with this authenticate logic. And I think the simplest way to check this is, first, let me double check email and password. Let's take a quick look at the definition of this function. It looks like maybe I should just pass in the whole request. Let's see what's going on here. Email, password. Let's just print both of these. Because what this should essentially do is select star from token where user equals trainer. Or I'm sorry, that's actually happening down here. This should be looking against, this should be using the hash password in the email to grab that trainer's info and actually giving us back the trainer model. So let's run this request again and see where we went wrong. So those both look correct. I thought that was the correct password for Alice. we got trainer back. I wonder if I'm making a bad assumption about what authenticate returns, though as I hover over here, it says if the given credentials are valid, returns a user object. So I wonder if I don't have Alice in the database or if the credentials are invalid. Let's see what's in the database. Alice is there. I've been using the same password for everyone. Let's just create a new user, Frank. Frank with an E. And now let's try that login with Frank, though I suspect this will fail as well. Yeah, so this should be returning the user. We're getting back none, which makes me think that the authentication is failing. So what I'm going to try just out of curiosity is let's get the same trainer a different way. Trainer objects get email equals email, right? And let's print same trainer, different way. Because this should be giving me my trainer. So this is, I feel like there's something obvious that I'm missing here. So this confirms Alice is there. We're able to use the email to get Alice. So I'm doing something wrong with using that authenticate function. Cody, yes, sir.
You want to just maybe try setting the request and then the username, then the password? Just put request there.
Oh, just send the whole request?
Yeah, request, comma, then the username, comma, then the password. I think just add request in the front.
Let's give it a shot. No. But I think you're onto something that I'm not using the Django authentication method, right? So let's pull up these docs and let's look at this authenticate function because it does indeed talk about passing in the request. We import authenticate, we set the username and the password. If user is not none, request is an optional HTTP request. So let's try the simplest version of all possible things, which is username alice@gmail.com, password XYZ123. Let's just hard code this data. Right, so we're not even using what's in the body of the request. I just want to get authenticate to work. So you may be onto something, Cody, because it clearly doesn't like the way that I'm trying to use it. And it does seem to indicate like passing in the request object there. I wonder what if we just pass in the request. I don't want to get too lost in this, but I do want to get this working. In fact, let's see if ChatGPT, how to use Django authenticate or token auth, it is returning none. So yeah, this JSON web framework stuff we can just ignore. Most of this stuff, it's giving me way more than we need here. Let's try simplifying. So credentials are correct. We should be implementing from abstract base user. I do implement from AbstractUser. I wonder if that is causing us an issue that's been going like undetected. But I think that should be okay. The user must be active to be authenticated. Check if the is active field of the user is set to true. That's a good one. All of these users are set is active to false. So that actually could be the issue that was escaping us here. So just for fun, what I'm going to do, though this is a total hack, is actually, let's just open up Mickey, yes, sir. And let me make sure I'm setting the user to is active the right way. Eric, yes, sir, what's up?
I don't know if I'm crazy, but I think when you showed the database view, is active was true, but is super user was false, and is something else was false. Is staff.
Oh, yeah, you're correct. I apologize. That's unfortunate. That would have been a nice fix. Yeah, folks, let me come back to this because I don't want to kind of spin our wheels on debugging. There's clearly a step I've missed here in this setup, though I kind of thought we had everything covered. But I don't think it's going to be useful for us to continue spinning our wheels on debugging. We've kind of gone through the obvious steps of the process. We've at least isolated the issue. Let's see. Yep. And they're even showing us in this ChatGPT example, passing in username and password. There has to be some sort of step related to setting up this authentication that I've missed. I don't think the super user or the staff things should impact us. I believe those only affect Django admin. Let's take one last stab at this. And just see if, rather than ChatGPT, Stack Overflow can help us here. And the only other thing I can think of is if maybe I need to be using abstract base user instead of abstract user. Again here, if user is active is false, which doesn't seem like it should be our issue. Earl John, yes, sir.
I was just wondering if we need to import the authenticate from the contrib auth.
We should be
Oh, okay.
importing it from contrib up here on line 3. You're absolutely correct that we do need to do that. But yeah, we should be importing it from the right spot. Yeah, folks, let me debug this one offline because I feel like we have most of the pieces working here. The other thing that's possible is I wonder if there's a step that I missed in the create user step that is important. Which seems unlikely, but is not impossible because we see the user created there. Earl John, yes, sir.
Could it be that when you initialize the new trainer, you didn't use the attribute create underscore user?
Oh my God. That is exactly it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just looking over some of that similar code. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I totally, because I was looking at that before, and let's see, here in the signup code, I remember mentioning it because I saw in our example code, we do it a little differently. Like we do this, but then what we actually do is like here inside the try block, we do like just, I don't know, instead of this, we do new trainer equals trainer objects create user. I wonder if there's new trainer. No, it's not there. Yeah, okay. That is almost definitely our issue here. Be honest, I don't know if I like having we can leave that validation code. I'm not thrilled with creating this model and then doing it twice, but I suspect that that is what's causing our problem. That's a good eye, because folks, I saw this earlier and I saw create. And I totally missed that this is create user. So let's go ahead and with this new code, create yet another user. Jack. And let's change this to sign up. So we've created Jack, right? Now here's our moment of truth with login. Oh, I would have thought that would have taken care of it. So that is absolutely something that we need to do. So let me come back to this, folks. I'll debug this and get this working offline. I think this change probably needed to happen. I wonder if it resolved it, though I shouldn't have to restart the server for changes in view code. So I think it should be being applied when we just created Jack. Oh, and we don't need that. In the interest of time, let me just show you what the code looks like for the info view, and also how we can simplify some of our logout and info code as well. Because I'm not sure that it's going to be productive to keep debugging. And most of this, we should be able to use the, like when I create users, we can use those auth tokens, and I think it will work. It seems to be working for other things. So let's see how far we can get. So I apologize for this and for this transition, but we'll circle back to that one later. Let's build out this info API view, and the goal here is just to return basic info about the user belonging to the auth token. So we're expecting this to be an authenticated request as well. So I'm going to have to do the same things we did with logout with these 2 lines of code. Because this is what ensures that token authentication is being applied to that request, and that we set the permission level where the request has to have an authenticated user before we do this. And in fact, what we can do to simplify this, because we're going to want to do this in a lot of different places, is we can make a class named token rec, which is short for token request, and have it inherit API view. And we can just give it these 2 things. And that's all it needs. And then here, I can inherit from the token request class and over here as well. So I did want to make sure to show this to folks because this is a very useful and flexible pattern, because now I have one class that has all the stuff I need to apply authentication, right, against an API view. And we can just inherit it wherever we want to use it. And so now for this info endpoint, it's going to take a GET request. And let's just have it print out the user associated with the request. This will actually be a useful test too, to see if this works or if it breaks with the issue we were having with login. And we're just going to return a response that has request.user.email. And for consistency, I might as well wrap it in a dictionary. Because again, remember, Django should be giving us the user when we pass in a valid auth token. Now, whether the other issues I'm having will interfere with this or not, I think remains to be seen. Kind of running out of, we're getting deep into the letters here. We might as well stop and restart this server. So let's grab this information for Kyle and just stick it here in the README. And we're going to update our request to go to API/v1/users/info, right? Because that's the route that we created in URLs.py. And now if I look at the headers, oh, I hope it was not sending this auth token the whole time. It should not have been, because that was not checked. That would cause an issue if it was. So here we see what we want, where because I'm hitting this info endpoint on the GET request, but I'm not passing an auth token, we get back a 401 unauthorized. Authentication credentials were not provided. And that's because of this token request class where we set the authentication class and the permission classes. Right? So now let's add that authorization token. And I'm going to hop over to the README and I'm going to grab it here. And all I need is the token. And let's do authorization. I'm going to do a little test to see if Thunder Client is actually sending this auth token. Okay, good. It is not. And so now this works and we get Kyle's email back, right? Because we used Kyle's auth token. And if I'd used someone else's auth token, I would get their email back. So here we do see authentication working, which does make the fact that the login was not working drive me a little more nuts, to be totally honest. But we've kind of been banging our heads against that wall for a minute. So I'll come back to it later. I'll definitely follow up with that. We already implemented logout, and we saw it was pretty straightforward. And now we've implemented this info endpoint. So again, if say, think about getting a to-do list, this token rec class is how you can apply authentication on a to-do list. And although something is going wrong here with this authenticate step that is driving me a little nuts, we see the core steps here laid out. We need to get the email. We need to get the password for authenticate. We can pass in the request. I think I usually see it done this way with username and password. And then it should be giving us back the user, the model instance, but that's where it's failing. But once it does give us back the user, and in fact, just to fake this, to get this working, I'm going to do this. Trainer objects get email equals email. Right? Let's just fake this so we can see this token part working. Where once we have the trainer, we use this token get or create method and we pass it our user object instance, and it returns back the token key or the token object and a Boolean, just letting us know if the token was created or if it already existed. And then we would send this back. So obviously the authentication piece of this is a little broken, but let's go ahead and just do this for Alice just for fun. So we can get Alice's token back. And so here's Alice and here's her token. And now if I want to use Alice's token instead of Kyle's on that info endpoint, we get back Alice's info. Or, excuse me, let's make this get and info. And we don't need anything in the body of this request. So let's just get rid of it. And we get back Alice's info. Right, so that's the power of the token. This is probably a good stopping point because I think we spun our wheels for a bit with the debugging. The one piece that is important to see, I think, for use of Django admin is we do have to create, we have to set that user to be staff and super user if we want them to be able to use Django admin. So let's actually just code that up so we can see that as an example as well. And I'm just going to do admin signup. And I'm just going to name this and then sign up. And then here in views.py, and let's put this down here. We're writing an API view. It's going to take a post request. And we're going to, so the way this is written, it creates a new user. We could write a different kind of endpoint or code somewhere else if we wanted to make an existing user an admin user. But here we can see the steps. And I do want to modify this a bit to use the pattern that we've been doing like this. I do data username equals request data get email. And put that there. And then the main things that we're going to want to do are, I wonder if, all right, we'll come back to this because I wonder if I just found the issue. We need to set for the admin user is staff true. Admin user is super user true. Let's do a full clean. And let's do admin user save. Let's make a token. And let's return a response. And we'll do a 201 created. And I'm wondering if the issue here in the login code is if I need to add a trainer, or I'm sorry, in the signup code is if I need to add a trainer save step right there, which would drive me a little nuts if it's the case, though it seems pretty unlikely. But let's go ahead and create our admin user. And we need to make sure to not pass the auth header. And in here, we're going to do email, and I'm going to go back from Z. And so this user has been created. If we hop into pSQL and we look at all our different users, way down here, we see Zeke. We see they're set to is staff and is active. It looks like they are also set to is super user, which is correct and as it should be. So is staff, is active, and is super user. And now I doubt this was the issue, but let's try creating a new user and logging them in. I don't think this will work, but so that actually did work. That actually may have solved the problem. Let's test this one more time. Let's make another user. If we're going in order here of letters, I think Mike would be up next. Let's, just for fun, let's even log Mike out. I wonder if that was an issue that the user was already logged in. I think that's unlikely. So log out is a post request. We need to use Mike's auth token to do it. So let's grab Mike's auth token. And let's actually, let's log Mike in. And if that works, we'll log him out and log him back in. Not passing an authorization header. I have email and password in the request. So fingers crossed, that should work. Let's try logging Mike out. You don't want anything in the request. And we do want to pass the auth header with Mike's token. Let me make sure I have Mike's token, E6, something, something, something. So Mike is now logged out, right? And if I go to the info endpoint for Mike, even though I'm passing this token, we get unauthorized because we've deleted that token when Mike logged out. So now our real moment of the truth here is logging Mike back in. And that works. So we found our issue with the login code. Earl John, I think you had raised the first issue, and there were indeed two issues with my code with login. One was we absolutely do have to use, or excuse me, the issue is here with sign up. We absolutely do have to use the create user method, which comes off of the model objects, right? Trader objects, user objects, create user. And we have to run new trainer save after that. And that seems to be the issue. And if I had to guess, we won't be able to see the issue here in the user model, but it's probably in one of these like auth token models. Or possibly auth permission. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the difference is in terms of like the data model, like what wasn't happening. But we've resolved the issue, and this is now the correct code for sign up. So just to reiterate, and in fact, we should just move full clean. right over there. And let's just put all this in one spot. We create the trainer object. I don't even know if we need to do this, to be honest, anymore, because we do it right here, but I'll leave it there because it's working. We run full clean to validate, and then we save. So this and this are the key steps, and that's what I was getting wrong earlier. This is also why it's good to set up authentication early in your project and test it out, because the Django authentication system is really powerful. It's really great that once we have it set up, I can protect all of my endpoints with authentication just like this. It's great that Django gives me the user object if that request has a token, but it does mean complexity, where, as you saw, it's just really easy to make certain kinds of errors. All right, folks, thank you for the patience with debugging that and for the help. Hopefully that was useful to see as well. We are at time, but we really covered everything we wanted to hit. There's a little bit of sort of quality of life code that I'll add to the demo code and point out when I post it. I just want to check in to see what questions people have, because I've been doing a lot of talking. So before we wrap, is there any bit of code that it would be useful to walk over or talk through a bit? Joseph, yes, sir.
So I don't really understand how adding the new trainer.save was fixing the issue, because when you went into the database, we saw that Alice and Evan or Ethan, whatever their names were, like they were already in there. So why was the save line? Is it just because that when you were signing up the user, that it was also logging them in, and then when you went to the login endpoint, that they were already logged in, so it was throwing an error?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not 100%, to be honest, because I also did not originally have objects.createUser. And once I added that, we did test that out. I didn't restart the server, but I shouldn't have to for like changing view code, because for this stuff, Django just grabs the most recent version every time. I wonder if the Django docs have a clue here for us in maybe the behavior of this create user method. So I would concur, to be honest. And I wonder if maybe I actually did need to restart the database, or somehow I got something wrong in my testing process and like debugging once we added this change. You know, I am not 100% of line 31 is necessary, to be totally honest. Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because I agree with you. That stuff is in the database, and we did see it there. But I mean, that also indicates create user is doing something else. And part of it is we have all these different related tables, right? Like auth permission, auth token, auth group, and trainer app trainer. So, you know, I wonder if there's something in one of those tables that was not getting connected, if that makes sense. But I'm pretty sure, like, and I mean, you know, if we go to this lesson, do we have example code? Yeah, so we have example code that should work just fine for this. And let's see what we do here. So we just do trainer objects create user here. So it's very possible that that was the error I had. And just in debugging, once I made the change, I had some other bad assumption. So it's possible we don't need this .save at all. Though as we saw, using .save but not using create user does not work. Like there's something else that create user is doing that we need it to do. I don't know if that helps answer your question, as it's not really an answer, but it is a bit of a breakdown. And if we kind of dig through this create user function, I'm curious to see what it's doing that might be different from save. Yeah, here we see it, in fact, user.save gets called. It looks create user does some stuff to create and hash the password. That's pretty important. There's something also here with the username. I don't know if it's important or not. So I'm not entirely sure. I think the key step is trainer objects create user. And honestly, I would say let's start there. In fact, I would say let's just, now that we've got this fixed, let's just answer this. Let's kill this. Let's quit the Django shell. Let's drop the database. Let's create it again. So there are no users at all in there. Let's just get rid of that stuff. And let's see how we do. So server's running. No trainers. No tokens, right? Let's create Alice. Alice is created. Let's dump that down here. Let's try logging in with Alice. No authorization header. And that does indeed work. So yeah, you're totally right. We don't need the .save. Once I added this, I must have, maybe I did need to restart the server or something happened. Full clean, we probably should do as a good practice, but this is really like the minimum necessary to create a user. And this was the issue that I was having before, is I wasn't using create user, and it's probably something special that it does with the password. That was the issue. What else might be good to go over in the code before we break, or other questions that folks have? Cody, yes, sir. And Joseph, thank you. That was a great point.
I guess 2 quick questions for log out. You inherited that token Rex. Did you have to call it?
Yeah,
for your
great
class?
question. We do not. So
You do not have.
yeah, token rec sets these class attributes, these properties essentially. And token rec inherits API view, and Django REST framework, like when an HTTP request comes in and is being handled by one of these methods, they will look at these to figure out what they have to do. So they will call whatever code needs to be called in these for us. Like if we take a look at this class definition, there's an authenticate function, authenticate credentials, authenticate header, get model. So Django or just Django REST framework will actually call those methods on that class. And same if we look at is authenticated, we see that this has permission class. And And so the token authenticate class gets called first, and once that's done, Django and Django REST framework will call this has permission class for us. So all I have to do is make sure that these are set on whatever class I want those authentication and permission rules to be applied for, and we can do that just with the inheritance. Does that help answer your question?
It does, yeah. And then how does that know? So you said that this makes sure that someone else can't log someone, like, so Adam can't log, you know, Carol out, or Alice can't log Carol out. So
Yeah.
So how does it know that Adam's not the one calling here to log Carol out?
Yeah, great question. So let's grab Alice's token. And I should have added actually to the info endpoint, like if they're logged in or not. That would be kind of cool to see. Though there's actually, I guess, not a lot of value, because if you're not logged in, you won't see stuff. But so this logout endpoint, all it does is it needs there to be an auth token. And I'll kind of show you guys where some of that is set. Right? I don't need anything in the body of the JSON request. I just need the auth token. And the key thing to remember about this token is the token is unique to each user. So when Django gets this HTTP request, and in fact, let's go look at this token authentication code again. This authenticate function right here. This is the HTTP request. Here's some method that grabs the authentication header and gets the auth token specifically from it. And we see, in fact, here's that error message that we were seeing. Once it has the auth token, it runs some sort of mathy stuff to decode it. And what it can get from the way that the auth token is constructed, it gets, actually it probably doesn't, it doesn't get the username, but it validates that the token is good. And then in the database, we have that token table and that auth and that user table, and those are connected. So we can use the database to see what token belongs to what user. Like, let's look at select star from auth token. Right, so Django gets the token from the headers of the HTTP request. It decodes it basically to validate that the token is good. And then I'm pretty darn sure if we look at this authenticate credentials, I don't want to dig into it too deep, but in essence, because right here in this auth token table, on the one hand, we have the key, and on the other hand, we have the user ID. Once we know that the auth token is valid, we know what user it belongs to. And then that's how Django will grab the user. And in fact, in this authenticate credentials, we can kind of see that happening right here, where if we take a look at the token model, we'll actually see it connected to the user with a one-to-one relationship. And so they're moving backwards off of the token model using related names to get the user. I think I'm getting that in the right order. I might be getting it a little mixed up, but in essence, you get the token model, off of that, you get the user, and then we return the user. And that's how Django can grab and connect the user with the request if it has a valid auth token. And if we scroll all the way up here, somewhere in here, it must import. Maybe it doesn't import the token class in here, but if we hop over to our models, we can see there it is. The token model and this one-to-one relationship with the user model, which for us is the trainer. I realized I went in deep there. Did that help, or was that a little too much jumping around code?
I mean, I was able to follow. I think that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's really useful to understand that the key thing here, this auth token uniquely identifies a user, and Django can use that to figure out who the user is and scope all the permissions and everything else it does to that. And so now when Alice logs out, well, now there's an error for some reason that I don't know, because I don't have a slash at the end. Best possible kind of error, the one that's easy to fix. If I actually add the authorization header, Alice is logged out, right? And if I had a different user's authorization token there, then that would be logged out. So that's why like the authentication step with the email and password is so important, because I give Django my email and password. Django says, cool, Adam, you are who you say you are. Here's your authorization token so you can do stuff. What else is on people's minds that might be good to go over a bit? And I do realize we ran a bit long, so this is probably a good stopping point. Let me go ahead and stop the